Welcome to What If Sleep Storin', where What If whispers timeless tales into dreams. Breathe deeply, let your mind soften, and drift into tonight's gentle story. What if, on a fog-wrapped Sunday in Victorian London, curious minds unravelled mysteries that dance between the seen and unseen, where gaslight flickered against shadows that held more secrets than the city's countless chimneys. So dim the lights, find your most comfortable position, and let these whispered narratives carry you softly towards sleep. If this tale finds you drifting towards sleep's edge, let me know where in the world you're listening. These stories travel far on whispered winds. Give it a like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely like what I do here. Sunday afternoons in Victorian London possessed a peculiar quality, as if time itself had decided to take tea and linger longer than propriety might suggest. The city breathed differently on such days, slower, deeper, with the rhythm of church bells marking hours that seemed to stretch like taffy in a confectioner's window. Along Baker Street the fog rolled in gentle waves, not the harsh, choking yellow pea soupers that plagued weekday mornings, but rather a soft grey embrace that muffled the clip-clop of hansom cabs and transformed gaslight into amber halos floating in the mist. The year was 1887, and London stood at the crossroads of old and new, where tradition waltzed awkwardly with progress. Steam engines huffed their mechanical prayers alongside church bells, while electric lights began to challenge the dominance of gas flames in the more fashionable districts. It was an era when gentlemen still tipped their hats to ladies on the street, when calling cards held the power of royal decrees, and when a Sunday afternoon's peace was considered as sacred as any cathedral service. In the heart of this fog-kissed metropolis, at the familiar address of 221B Baker Street, two men found themselves in that particular state of Sunday languor that seemed to settle over respectable Londoners like dust on forgotten furniture. The sitting room, with its well-worn Persian carpet and chairs that had moulded themselves to their occupants' forms over countless evenings, held comfortable staleness of pipe tobacco, old leather, and the faint medicinal scent of carbolic acid that seemed to follow Dr. John Watson like a faithful spaniel. Sherlock Holmes reclined in his favourite armchair, long legs stretched toward the dying embers of the morning's fire. His angular frame appeared almost liquid in the afternoon light that filtered through the lace curtains, casting patterns that shifted and danced like living shadows across his sharp features. His fingers, steepled beneath his chin, moved occasionally in what Watson had learned to recognise as the detective's method of conducting some internal symphony of thought. The great consulting detective's grey eyes held that distant quality they acquired when his mind wandered the labyrinthine corridors of London's mysteries, even when no particular case demanded his attention. "You know, Watson," Holmes murmured, his voice carrying the lazy cadence of a man who had nowhere pressing to be, "there is something almost criminally peaceful about a London Sunday. It's as if the city has agreed to a temporary ceasefire with chaos itself." Dr. Watson looked up from his copy of the Strand magazine, where he had been reading with the determined concentration of a man trying to avoid the creeping drowsiness that Sunday afternoon seemed to specialise in inducing. His military bearing, softened by years of comfortable civilian life, relaxed further into the generous embrace of his leather chair. The doctor's moustache twitched slightly, a habit Watson had developed when amused by his friend's observations. "Criminally peaceful, you say?" Watson chuckled, setting aside his magazine with the careful deliberation of a man who suspected it might not be picked up again for some time. Only you, Holmes, could find something suspicious about tranquillity. The detective's lips curved in what might charitably be called a smile, though it held more mischief than warmth. "Not suspicious, my dear fellow, merely unusual. London is rather like a great theatrical production, you see. The actors change, the scenery shifts, but the drama never truly stops. On Sundays, however, it's as if someone has called for an intermission that stretches far longer than the audience expected." Outside their window, Baker Street performed its Sunday pantomime with the dedication of seasoned actors. A flower girl walked by, her basket of wilting chrysanthemums and late roses creating splashes of colour against the grey afternoon. Her voice, calling fresh flowers lovely flowers, carried the musical quality that came from years of practice, yet held a gentleness that weekday urgency never allowed. A gentleman in a top hat that had seen better decades paused to purchase a small bouquet, his transactions, conducted with the elaborate courtesy that Victorian society demanded, even, or perhaps especially, on the Sabbath. The fog continued its patient work, softening edges and muffling sounds until the world beyond their sitting room seemed wrapped in cotton batting. Somewhere in the distance a church bell chimed 3 o'clock with the self-satisfied resonance of bronze that knew its own importance. Closer by, Mrs. Hudson could be heard moving about in the kitchen below, her footsteps creating a rhythm as comforting and predictable as a heartbeat. Holmes shifted in his chair, the leather creaking softly in protest. His fingers drummed a silent melody against the chair's arm, a sign, Watson knew, that despite his proclaimed appreciation for the afternoon's peace, the detective's restless mind was already beginning to chafe against the constraints of inactivity. "I sometimes wonder," Holmes continued, his gaze fixed on the fog-obscured street, "whether London's criminals observe the Sabbath with the same devotion as its churchgoers. Do pickpockets take Sunday off? Do confident men suspend their schemes in favour of morning prayers?" Watson laughed, a warm sound that seemed to chase away some of the afternoon's lethargy. "I suspect criminals are much like doctors, Holmes. Crime, like illness, rarely respects the calendar. Though I must admit, there does seem to be something about Sunday afternoons that encourages contemplation rather than action." The doctor rose from his chair with the slightly stiff movements of a man whose old war wound complained more on damp days. He walked to the window, hands clasped behind his back in a gesture that spoke of years spent watching and waiting in various capacities. The view from their window never failed to fascinate him, the constant stream of London life flowing past like a river of human hopes and struggles. "Look there," Watson said, nodding toward the street. "Mrs. Pemberton from number 224, taking her Sunday constitutional with that ancient pug of hers. The dog moves so slowly it's a wonder they complete their circuit before nightfall." Holmes joined his friend at the window, his movements carrying the unconscious grace of a man accustomed to observing without being observed. "Ah, but notice how she adjusts her pace to match his. That, Watson, is either the deepest form of compassion or the most elaborate form of procrastination known to mankind." They watched in comfortable silence as the elderly woman and her equally elderly companion made their laborious progress down the fog-shrouded street. The pug, whose breathing could probably be heard from their second-story window on a clearer day, paused every few steps to investigate scents that existed in a canine universe far removed from human concerns. Mrs. Pemberton waited patiently each time, her gloved hands folded over the handle of her walking stick, her expression holding the serene acceptance of someone who had learned that life's greatest pleasures often came at the slowest pace. "There's something to be said for their approach to time," Watson observed. "No urgent appointments, no pressing deadlines. Just the simple pleasure of moving through the world at exactly the speed that feels right." Holmes nodded, though his fingers continued their restless drumming against the window frame. "Indeed, though I confess, Watson, that after 3 hours of such philosophical observation, I find myself rather hoping that someone, somewhere in London, is engaged in something slightly more stimulating." As if summoned by the detective's words, the sound of rapid footsteps on the stairs outside their door cut through the afternoon's drowsy rhythm. Both men turned from the window, Watson with the alert posture of a former military man, Holmes with the predatory stillness of a cat that had just spotted movement in tall grass. The footsteps belonged to someone taking the stairs 2 at a time, with the determined urgency of a person who had wrestled with indecision for some time before finally surrendering to the need for action. The steps paused outside their door, and both men could hear the sound of someone taking deep, steadying breaths, the kind of preparation one might make before diving into cold water or confessing a secret. "It appears," Holmes murmured, his grey eyes brightening with the first spark of genuine interest they had shown all afternoon, "that London's dramatic intermission may be coming to an end." The knock, when it came, held neither the confident rap of someone certain of their welcome, nor the timid tap of someone afraid of disturbing the peace. Instead, it carried a peculiar quality, urgent yet hesitant, as if the person on the other side of the door was simultaneously desperate to enter and terrified of what they might set in motion by doing so. Watson moved toward the door with the practised efficiency of a man accustomed to receiving unexpected visitors at all hours. In their years together on Baker Street, he had learned to read the subtle variations in how people approach their door. This particular knock spoke of someone wrestling with forces they didn't understand, someone who had exhausted other options before finally seeking the aid of London's only consulting detective. "Come in," Watson called, his voice carrying the warmth that had comforted patients and colleagues alike throughout his medical career. The door opened to admit a figure that seemed to embody the very essence of Victorian respectability in crisis. The man who entered was perhaps 40 years of age, with the kind of carefully maintained appearance that suggested someone whose livelihood depended on maintaining public confidence. His dark suit was well-tailored but not ostentatious, his boots polished to a mirror shine that even the fog couldn't dim. Yet despite these marks of careful grooming, everything about him suggested a man whose ordered world had recently suffered a significant tremor. His hair, pomaded with the dedication of someone who understood that a gentleman's appearance was his calling card, showed evidence of having been run through with anxious fingers. His collar, while properly starched, sat slightly askew in the way that suggested its wearer had been tugging at it nervously. Most tellingly, his eyes, a pale blue that might have been pleasant under normal circumstances, held the slightly wild look of someone who had seen something that challenged his fundamental understanding of how the world operated. "Gentlemen," the man began, his voice carrying a slight accent that suggested origins somewhere in the American South, though years of London residence had softened its edges. "I do apologise for disturbing your Sunday afternoon, but I find myself in circumstances that I fear will not wait for more conventional business hours." Holmes had moved away from the window with the fluid grace of a man whose interest had been thoroughly awakened. His penetrating gaze took in every detail of their visitor's appearance with the systematic thoroughness of a botanist examining a particularly intriguing specimen. Watson observed his friend's face transform from the drowsy contentment of moments before into the sharp focus that had solved some of London's most perplexing mysteries. "Please," Watson said, gesturing toward the chair he had recently vacated, "make yourself comfortable. I am Dr. Watson, and this is my colleague, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. You seem distressed. May I offer you some tea? Mrs. Hudson keeps a pot warm on Sunday afternoons." The man's gratitude was evident in the way his shoulders sagged slightly as he accepted the offered seat. "You are most kind, Dr. Watson. Tea would be most welcome. I confess, I have been walking the streets for the better part of 2 hours, trying to summon the courage to call upon you." Holmes settled into his own chair with the careful attention of a man preparing to engage with a puzzle that might prove worthy of his abilities. 2 hours is quite a long time to spend in contemplation, particularly on a day when the fog makes walking anything but pleasant. You must forgive my curiosity, but what could drive a man to pace London's streets in such weather before finally seeking consultation? Their visitor accepted the cup of tea that Watson prepared, with hands that trembled slightly, not with age or infirmity, but with the kind of nervous energy that comes from carrying a burden one is afraid to share. He took a sip of the warm liquid, and some of the tension seemed to leave his frame, as if the simple ritual of afternoon tea had reminded him that he was, despite everything, still in a world governed by familiar social conventions. "My name," he began, setting the cup carefully in its saucer with the precision of someone using routine to maintain composure, "is Jasper Crane. I am the manager of the Orpheum Theatre on Drury Lane. Perhaps you gentlemen are familiar with the establishment?" Watson nodded. "Indeed, a fine theatre with an excellent reputation. I believe you've recently been running a production of The Merchant of Venice, have you not?" Mr. Crane's pale eyes brightened slightly at this recognition. "Yes, exactly so. Shakespeare has been very good to us this season. The production has been running for 6 weeks now, and we had hoped to continue for at least another month." He paused, and the brightness faded from his expression. Had hoped, that is, until the events of last evening. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his fingers forming that familiar steeple beneath his chin. Events that were sufficiently disturbing to send you walking through London's fog for 2 hours before seeking assistance. I take it these events were not part of Mr. Shakespeare's original script. Despite his obvious distress, Mr. Crane managed a weak smile at Holmes's dry observation. No, Mr. Holmes, though I sometimes wonder if the bard himself might have found them worthy of inclusion in one of his more supernatural works. He took another steady sip of tea before continuing. What I am about to tell you, gentlemen, will sound like the ravings of a man whose nerves have gotten the better of him. Indeed, I have spent the night and morning attempting to convince myself that what I witnessed was nothing more than a trick of stage lighting, an optical illusion brought on by the strain of managing a theatrical production. The afternoon light filtering through their windows had begun to take on the golden quality that marked the slow transition from day toward evening. Outside, the fog continued its patient work, transforming Baker Street into something that might have emerged from one of the very theatrical productions Mr. Crane managed. The distant sounds of Sunday London, church bells, the occasional carriage, the muffled voices of pedestrians created a gentle backdrop that seemed almost designed to encourage confidence. Holmes's expression had shifted into what Watson recognised as his hunting look, the sharp focus of a mind that had detected the scent of genuine mystery. Mr. Crane, in my experience, the events that trouble us most deeply are rarely the products of mere imagination. The mind, you see, is remarkably resistant to accepting what it considers impossible. If something has shaken your rational convictions sufficiently to send you seeking help from a consulting detective, I would venture to say it deserves serious consideration. Mr. Crane set down his teacup with a decisive clink that seemed to signal his commitment to full disclosure. Very well then. Last evening, during the final performance of our Saturday run, I witnessed something that challenges everything I understand about the natural world. He paused, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. I saw, as clearly as I see you both now, the ghost of Edmund Blackwood. The name fell into the quiet sitting room like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples of recognition that both Holmes and Watson felt, though neither immediately spoke. Edmund Blackwood had been one of London's most celebrated actors during the 1850s and 60s, renowned for his passionate interpretations of Shakespeare's tragic heroes. His death in 1875, at the relatively young age of 45, had been mourned throughout London's theatrical community as the loss of an irreplaceable talent. Watson was the first to break the silence that followed this revelation. Edmund Blackwood? But surely, Mr. Crane, that's impossible. Blackwood died more than a decade ago. I remember reading his obituary in the Times. Indeed, Dr. Watson, he did die 12 years ago this coming December, which is precisely why his appearance in my theatre last evening has left me in such a state. Mr. Crane's voice carried the weight of a man who understood exactly how his words sounded and who had made peace with whatever judgment might follow. Yet I saw him, gentlemen, as plainly as daylight. He stood in box 5 watching our production with the same intense concentration he was famous for during his lifetime. Holmes had remained silent during this exchange, but Watson could see the rapid calculations taking place behind his friend's sharp grey eyes. The detective's fingers had resumed their silent drumming, a sure sign that his mind was sorting through possibilities with the speed and precision of a master chess player, contemplating his next several moves. Box 5, Holmes said finally, his voice carrying a note of interest that suggested this detail held particular significance. An interesting choice of vantage point. Box 5 offers an excellent view of the stage, but it also provides a degree of privacy that the orchestra stalls do not. Tell me, Mr. Crane, was this box occupied by any living patron during last evening's performance? Mr. Crane shook his head with the emphatic certainty of a man who had checked and double-checked this particular detail. That is precisely what makes the entire incident so inexplicable, Mr. Holmes. Box 5 was not sold for last evening's performance. In fact, It has remained unsold for the entire run of our current production. The box has something of an unfortunate reputation among our regular patrons. Several have complained of feeling unusually cold when seated there, and others have reported hearing whispers during the quieter moments of performances. Watson leaned forward, his medical training asserting itself in the face of what seemed to be either a case of collective suggestion or something more genuinely mysterious. Have you considered the possibility that these reports might be the result of suggestion, perhaps combined with the natural acoustics of an older building? Theatres, particularly those with a long history, often develop reputations that can influence how people interpret perfectly normal phenomena. I had considered that possibility, Dr. Watson, which is why I made it my habit to personally inspect Box 5 before each performance. Last evening was no exception. I checked the box myself at 7 o'clock, a full hour before curtain. It was empty, properly cleaned, and showed no signs of having been disturbed since the previous evening's inspection. Holmes rose from his chair with this sudden energy of a man whose interest had been thoroughly captured. He began to pace, a habit Watson recognised as the physical manifestation of his friend's mental processes, engaging with a problem that promised genuine complexity. "Yet you observed someone in this empty box during the performance," Holmes said, his tone suggesting not scepticism, but rather a methodical approach to understanding the facts. "Describe exactly what you saw, Mr. Crane, with as much detail as you can recall. Where were you positioned when you made this observation? What was the lighting situation? How long did the figure remain visible?" Mr. Crane closed his eyes, clearly making an effort to recall the experience with perfect accuracy. "I was standing in the wings, stage left, as is my custom during the final act. From that position, I have a clear view of most of the audience, including the boxes. The stage lighting was relatively dim during the scene in question, the courtroom sequence in the fourth act, which made the audience area more visible than it would be during brighter moments." He opened his eyes and looked directly at Holmes. The figure appeared shortly after Portia began her quality of mercy speech. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, as the box had been empty moments before, but as I watched, the figure became more distinct. He was leaning forward slightly, his hands resting on the velvet rail of the box, watching the stage with an intensity that was unmistakable. "And you recognise this figure as Edmund Blackwood?" Watson asked. "Forgive me, Mr. Crane, but it has been 12 years since his death. Are you certain of the identification?" Mr. Crane's smile held a touch of the professional pride that comes from years of experience in a specialised field. "Dr. Watson, I have been involved in London's theatrical community for nearly 20 years. I saw Edmund Blackwood perform dozens of times during his career, and I had the privilege of working with him on 3 separate productions during my earlier days as an assistant stage manager. His face, his posture, his particular way of holding his head when concentrating on a performance, these are details burned into my memory." The afternoon had continued its gentle progression toward evening while they spoke, and the quality of light in the sitting room had grown richer, more golden. Mrs. Hudson's activities in the kitchen below provided a comforting counterpoint to their conversation, the domestic sound serving as an anchor to normalcy in the face of Mr. Crane's extraordinary claims. Holmes paused in his pacing to stand before the fireplace, one elbow resting on the mantelpiece in a pose that Watson knew indicated his friend's mind was working through the logical implications of what they had heard. "How long did this apparition remain visible?" Holmes asked. "The entire speech, which runs approximately 4 minutes. He watched with the kind of focused attention that Blackwood was famous for. You know how some audience members fidget or whisper, but Blackwood always watched performances as if his life depended on absorbing every gesture, every inflection. And then, when the scene ended and the stage lighting brightened for the final moments of the play, he simply wasn't there anymore. The box was empty, just as it had been during my inspection." Watson found himself caught between his rational medical training and the evident sincerity of their visitor. "Mr. Crane, I hope you won't take offence at this question, but have you been under any particular strain recently? Managing a theatrical production involves considerable stress, and sometimes—" Mr. Crane held up a hand with a gesture that suggested he had anticipated this line of inquiry. "Dr. Watson, you are entirely correct to consider such possibilities. I have indeed been under considerable pressure. Our current production represents a significant financial investment for the theatre, and its success is crucial to our continued operation. However, I am not the only witness to these phenomena. This revelation caused both Holmes and Watson to focus their attention more sharply on their visitor. Holmes returned to his chair, settling into it with the controlled movements of a man who sensed the conversation was about to take a significant turn. "Other witnesses?" Holmes prompted. "3 members of our company have reported similar sightings over the past 2 weeks. Sarah Whitmore, our leading lady, claimed to have seen a figure watching from Box 5 during Tuesday evening's performance. She described it as a gentleman in evening dress who seemed familiar but out of place. At the time, I attributed her report to opening night nerves. Sarah is a talented actress, but she tends toward the dramatic even off stage." Mr. Crane continued, his voice gaining strength as he recounted these additional testimonies. "Then, this past Thursday, our prompter, Mr. Davies, mentioned seeing someone in the box who appeared to be taking notes during the second act. Davies has worked in London theatres for 30 years and is not given to flights of fancy. When I asked him to describe the figure, his description matched both Sarah's account and what I myself observed last evening." Watson exchanged a glance with Holmes, noting the way his friend's eyes had sharpened with genuine interest. Whatever was happening at the Orpheum Theatre, it had moved beyond the realm of a single person's possible hallucination into something that demanded more serious consideration. "And the third witness?" Holmes inquired. "Young Timothy Fletcher, one of our stagehands. He's only 17, but he's been with us for nearly 2 years and is remarkably observant. Timothy reported seeing the gentleman who watches but doesn't clap on Friday evening. When I pressed him for details, he described a man in formal attire who observed the performance with unusual intensity, but never joined in the applause that punctuated particularly well-received speeches." Holmes's fingers had resumed their steepling position, and Watson could practically see the wheels of deduction turning behind his friend's penetrating gaze. "Mr. Crane, these sightings have occurred with increasing frequency over the past 2 weeks, culminating in your own observation last evening. Has anything changed at the theatre during this period? Any alterations to the building, changes in staff, or unusual incidents?" Mr. Crane considered this question with the thoroughness of someone who had clearly been wrestling with the same puzzles. "The only significant change has been our current production itself. We opened The Merchant of Venice 3 weeks ago, replacing a rather unsuccessful comedy that had been struggling to find its audience. The Blackwood sightings began shortly after we opened the Shakespeare." "Interesting," Holmes murmured. "Was Edmund Blackwood particularly associated with The Merchant of Venice during his career?" "Indeed he was, Mr. Holmes. His portrayal of Sherlock was considered one of his finest achievements. He played the role in 3 separate productions during the 1860s, and critics consistently praised his interpretation as both sympathetic and terrifying." Mr. Crane paused, a thought clearly occurring to him. In fact, his final performance of Shylock took place at the Orpheum in December of 1874, just months before his death. The implications of this revelation seemed to hang in the air like the fog outside their window. Watson found himself remembering stories he'd heard during his medical training about patients who claimed to see deceased relatives in moments of crisis or transition. Yet those cases typically involved individuals under extreme emotional or physical stress, not multiple witnesses observing the same phenomenon over an extended period. Holmes rose again and moved to the window, where the afternoon light was beginning its transition toward the softer hues of early evening. The fog had thickened slightly, transforming Baker Street into a scene that might have emerged from one of the Gothic novels that were so popular among London's reading public. "Mr. Crane," Holmes said without turning from the window, "what exactly do you hope to accomplish by consulting with me? If you believe you are witnessing genuine supernatural phenomena, I fear my methods are rather more terrestrial in nature." Mr. Crane's response came with the firmness of a man who had given considerable thought to this very question. "Mr. Holmes, I am a practical man who has spent his career in a business that depends on creating convincing illusions. I understand how lighting, positioning and suggestion can create effects that seem impossible to audiences. What I cannot understand is how such effects could be achieved in my theatre without my knowledge particularly given the specific location and timing of these sightings. He leaned forward in his chair, his voice taking on a note of urgent sincerity. "I do not necessarily believe in ghosts, Mr. Holmes, but I am certain that something is happening in my theatre that defies conventional explanation. If these phenomena have a rational cause, if someone is somehow creating these appearances for reasons I cannot fathom, then I need to understand how and why. The alternative ... He trailed off, his expression troubled. "The alternative," Watson completed, "is that your theatre is genuinely haunted, which would present considerable challenges for continued operation." "Precisely, Doctor. Watson, word of these sightings is beginning to spread among our company and crew. While some actors might relish the idea of performing in a haunted theatre, others find the notion deeply disturbing. More practically, if rumours reach our patrons, it could either drive them away in fear or attract them for entirely the wrong reasons. Neither outcome would serve the interests of serious theatrical production." Holmes turned from the window, his decision clearly made. "Mr. Crane, your problem presents several features of genuine interest. The multiple witnesses, the specific location and timing of the phenomena, and the historical connection to your current production all suggest a mystery worthy of investigation." He moved to his desk and began pulling on his gloves with the methodical care of a man preparing for action. "When is your next performance?" "This evening, Mr. Holmes. We perform every evening except Monday, with additional matinees on Wednesday and Saturday." "Excellent. Watson, I trust you would not object to an evening at the theatre. It has been some time since we've had the pleasure of Shakespeare's company." Watson was already reaching for his coat, his expression mixing curiosity with the satisfaction of a man whose Sunday afternoon languor had been thoroughly dispelled by the promise of genuine adventure. "Would be delighted, Holmes, though I confess I've never attended a theatrical performance with the specific goal of ghost hunting." Mr. Crane's relief was evident in the way his entire posture seemed to straighten. "Gentlemen, I cannot express how grateful I am for your willingness to investigate this matter. Should you indeed observe anything unusual this evening, perhaps you can shed some light on these mysterious circumstances." "Indeed," Holmes replied, his grey eyes bright with the anticipation of a challenging puzzle. "And if we observe nothing unusual, that too would be a significant data point. In my experience, Mr. Crane, the most interesting mysteries are often those that exist at the intersection of the possible and the impossible." The arrangements were quickly made. Mr. Crane would reserve Box 3 for Holmes and Watson, positioning them with an excellent view of the problematic Box 5, while maintaining enough distance to observe without being observed themselves. The performance would begin at 8 o'clock, giving them time to examine the theatre before the audience arrived and to position themselves strategically for the evening's investigation. As their visitor prepared to leave, Holmes posed one final question. "Mr. Crane, during your years in the theatrical community, did you ever hear anything about Edmund Blackwood's death that might be relevant to current circumstances? Sometimes the key to understanding present mysteries lies in properly comprehending past events." Mr. Crane paused at the door, his expression thoughtful. Blackwood's death was officially attributed to heart failure, though there were whispers at the time about the pressures he faced in his final months. He had been struggling with a series of professional disappointments, roles that didn't suit him, productions that failed to find audiences, critics who seemed to have turned against him. Some said he died of a broken heart as much as a failed one, and his final performance at the Orpheum, by all accounts, it was magnificent. Those who witnessed it said he poured everything he had left into that portrayal of Sherlock. Every disappointment, every frustrated ambition, every moment of artistic triumph and failure. It was as if he knew it would be his last opportunity to remind London of what they were losing. With this sobering reflection, Mr. Crane took his leave, expressing his gratitude once more and promising to meet them at the theatre's stage door at 7:30. The fog seemed to swallow him as soon as he stepped onto Baker Street, his figure becoming indistinct within moments of leaving their doorway. Holmes and Watson found themselves alone again in their sitting room, but the afternoon's peaceful languor had been completely dispelled by the promise of evening adventure. The detective immediately began his preparations with the systematic thoroughness that characterised his approach to any investigation. "Watson," Holmes said, moving to the shelf where he kept his various investigative tools, "what do you make of Mr. Crane's account? Your medical training gives you particular insight into cases where multiple individuals report similar unusual experiences." Watson settled back into his chair, but his posture remained alert rather than relaxed. "The consistency of the reported sightings is striking, Holmes. When dealing with cases of mass suggestion or shared delusion, one typically expects to see more variation in the details as each person's individual psychology influences their perception. Yet our three witnesses, an actress prone to drama, a practical prompter with decades of experience, and a young stage hand, all described remarkably similar phenomena. Indeed, and the timing suggests something more systematic than random hallucination. Holmes had selected a magnifying glass and a small notebook from his collection, along with a pencil that he tested carefully before slipping into his waistcoat pocket. The sightings began shortly after the current production opened, occur primarily during performance hours, and seem to focus on a single location with specific historical significance. The detective paused in his preparations, his expression taking on the distant quality that indicated deep thought. "There are, as I see it, three primary possibilities. First, that we are dealing with genuine supernatural phenomena, a hypothesis that I find difficult to accept without considerably more evidence than anecdotal reports, however consistent. The second possibility," Watson prompted, "that someone is deliberately creating these appearances for reasons as yet unknown. This would require considerable skill, intimate knowledge of the theatre's layout and operations, and access to equipment capable of producing convincing illusions. It would also require a motive, which remains entirely unclear." Holmes moved to the window again, watching the fog-shrouded street with the concentration of a man whose mind was working through complex calculations. "The third possibility is perhaps the most interesting, that we're dealing with a phenomenon that exists in the space between the natural and supernatural, something that has a rational explanation, but one that lies outside conventional understanding." Watson joined his friend at the window, noting how the gaslight had begun to create pools of amber illumination in the gathering dusk. "You're thinking of something specific, aren't you, Holmes?" "I am thinking, Watson, of the power of place and memory. Theatres are buildings designed to focus emotional energy, to create spaces where the boundary between reality and illusion becomes deliberately blurred. If Edmund Blackwood did indeed pour his heart and soul into his final performance at the Orpheum, if he died shortly afterward with important business left unfinished..." Holmes trailed off, clearly uncomfortable with the metaphysical implications of his own reasoning. "You're suggesting that some part of him might have remained attached to the place where he experienced his final triumph?" "I am suggesting, Watson, that there are forces in human experience that science has not yet learned to measure or explain. Whether we call them supernatural or simply not yet understood may be a matter of semantics rather than substance." The afternoon light continued its inexorable fade toward evening, and both men began their preparations for what promised to be a most unusual evening at the theatre. Holmes selected a dark suit that would allow him to blend into the shadows of a theatre box, while Watson chose attire appropriate for an evening's entertainment that might include elements of criminal investigation. As they prepared to leave Baker Street, the fog outside their window seemed to thicken with anticipation, transforming the familiar street into something mysterious and full of possibilities. The gaslight had begun its nightly battle against the darkness, creating pools of warm illumination that only emphasized the depth of the shadows between them. "Watson," Holmes said as he checked his pocket watch, "I find myself genuinely curious about this evening's events. It has been some time since we encountered a mystery that so thoroughly challenged conventional categories of explanation." "Indeed, Holmes, though I confess I'm not entirely certain whether I hope we encounter Mr. Blackwood's ghost, or discover a more terrestrial explanation for these phenomena." Holmes's smile held a hint of the anticipation that always accompanied his most interesting cases. "Perhaps, my dear Watson, the most satisfying outcome would be to discover that the truth, whatever it may be, is far more remarkable than either possibility we can currently imagine. The journey to Drury Lane took them through streets that seemed transformed by the fog and the approaching evening. London on a Sunday night possessed a different character entirely from its weekday persona, quieter, more contemplative, with the kind of hushed expectancy that comes when a great city prepares to transition from the sacred rhythms of the Sabbath to the secular energies of the week ahead. Their hansom cab moved through the fog-wrapped streets with the steady clip-clop of hooves on cobblestone that had become one of London's most familiar lullabies. The driver, wrapped in a heavy coat that made him appear more like a monument than a man, navigated the obscured streets with the confidence that came from years of experience reading the city's moods and movements. Gas lamps created islands of warm light in the grey sea of fog, each one revealing small tableaux of Sunday evening. London, couples walking arm in arm, gentlemen hurrying toward warm parlours, the occasional late churchgoer making their way home from evening service. As they travelled, Holmes maintained the thoughtful silence that Watson had learned to recognise as his friend's method of preparing his mind for the systematic observation that any investigation required. The detective's fingers drummed their familiar rhythm against the leather seat of the cab, and his eyes, though fixed on the fog-obscured scenery passing outside their window, held the distant focus of a man whose thoughts were already exploring the evening's possibilities. Watson found himself reflecting on the afternoon's revelations and the strange turn their peaceful Sunday had taken. The medical man in him remained sceptical of supernatural explanations, yet he could not dismiss the evident sincerity of Mr. Crane's account or the compelling consistency of the multiple witness reports. More intriguingly, he found himself genuinely curious about what the evening might reveal, a sentiment that surprised him with its intensity. The Orpheum Theatre, when they finally reached it through the fog-wrapped streets, presented itself as a structure that seemed designed by architects who understood the fundamental relationship between buildings and dreams. The facade, with its elaborate stonework and classical proportions, spoke of an era when theatrical entertainment was considered among the highest forms of cultural expression. Gas lamps flanked the main entrance, creating pools of warm light that drew early arriving patrons like moths to flame, their conversations creating a gentle buzz of anticipation that mixed with the fog to create an atmosphere both intimate and mysterious. Mr. Crane met them at the stage door as promised, his earlier nervousness having evolved into the focused energy of a man who had committed himself to a course of action and was determined to see it through. He led them through corridors that seemed to exist in their own pocket of time, where the scents of grease paint, old wood, and the accumulated dreams of decades of performances created an atmosphere unlike anywhere else in London. The theatre dates to 1847, Mr. Crane explained, as he guided them through passages that seemed to twist and turn with no apparent logic. It was built during the great expansion of London's theatrical district, designed by Charles Anderson, who was famous for creating buildings that seemed to capture the very essence of dramatic performance. Holmes examined the architecture with the systematic attention he brought to any environment that might yield clues. The acoustics would be excellent, he observed, noting the way their footsteps echoed in the corridors. Sound would carry clearly from any part of the building, but it would also be easy for someone to move about without being heard, if they understood the building's patterns. They emerged into the auditorium itself just as the house lights were being tested for the evening's performance. The sight that greeted them was one of considerable beauty. Rows of plush red seats arranged in perfect curves, boxes that seemed to float like elegant jewellery boxes along the walls, and a stage that even seemed to pulse with potential energy. The entire space spoke of generations of audiences who had gathered here to share in the fundamental human ritual of storytelling. Box 5, when Mr. Crane pointed it out to them, appeared unremarkable in every way. Located on the dress circle level, it offered an excellent view of the stage while providing the privacy that Victorian theatre goers valued. The red velvet seats looked comfortable and well maintained. The brass fittings gleamed with recent polishing, and nothing about the space suggested anything unusual or supernatural. "It looks perfectly ordinary," Watson observed, studying the box through a small pair of opera glasses that Holmes had produced from his coat pocket. "Indeed," Holmes replied. though his tone suggested that this very ordinariness might itself be significant. "Mr. Crane, during your inspection routine, have you ever noticed anything unusual about the physical condition of Box 5? Temperature variations, unusual drafts, anything that might suggest hidden passages or concealed mechanisms?" Mr. Crane shook his head. "Nothing whatsoever, Mr. Holmes. The box maintains the same temperature as the rest of the house, shows no signs of unusual wear or disturbance, and our maintenance staff reports nothing out of the ordinary during their regular cleaning routines." Holmes produced his magnifying glass and spent several minutes examining Box 5 from their vantage point in Box 3, paying particular attention to the sight lines, the positioning of the gas fixtures, and the relationship between the box and the stage below. Watson watched his friend work with the familiar fascination that came from observing a master craftsman applying his skills to a challenging problem. The audience began to arrive as 7:30 approached, and the theatre gradually filled with the kind of well-dressed, culturally sophisticated patrons that London's better establishments attracted. The sound of conversations, rustling programmes, and settling into seats created a gentle symphony of anticipation that seemed to make the very air shimmer with expectancy. Holmes and Watson took their positions in Box 3 just as the house lights began to dim. Their location provided them with an excellent view of both the stage and the problematic Box 5, which remained conspicuously empty as the curtain rose on Shakespeare's timeless tale of justice, mercy, and the complex relationships between different communities in Venice. The production itself proved to be of exceptionally high quality. The actress playing Portia brought both intelligence and warmth to the role, while the actor portraying Sherlock delivered a performance that managed to be both sympathetic and genuinely menacing. Watson found himself genuinely engaged with the drama unfolding on stage, though he remained conscious of their investigative purpose and kept one eye on the empty Box 5 throughout the first act. Holmes, by contrast, seemed to divide his attention equally between the performance and systematic observation of the theatre itself. He studied the other boxes, the positioning of the gaslights, the movements of the ushers and theatre staff, and the general patterns of audience behaviour with the methodical thoroughness of a scientist conducting a controlled experiment. It was during the second act, as the merchant Antonio faced the possibility of losing a pound of flesh to Shylock's knife, that Holmes suddenly stiffened in his seat. Watson, alerted by his friend's change in posture, followed the detective's gaze toward Box 5. At first, Watson saw nothing unusual. The box remained as empty as it had been throughout the evening, its red velvet seats catching the reflection of the stage lights in a way that created patterns of light and shadow, but nothing that could be mistaken for a human figure. He was about to ask Holmes what had caught his attention, when his own eyes detected something that made his breath catch in his throat. There, leaning forward slightly over the brass rail of Box 5, was the unmistakable silhouette of a man in evening dress. The figure appeared solid and real, yet something about the quality of the light that seemed to surround him suggested a presence that existed somehow apart from the normal physical laws that governed the rest of the theatre. Watson blinked hard, certain that his eyes were playing tricks on him, but when he looked again, the figure remained. The man in Box 5 watched the stage with an intensity that was almost palpable. His posture suggested complete absorption in the performance, the kind of focused attention that actors dream of receiving from their audiences. Even from their distance, Watson could see that the figure's hands gripped the rail of the box with the white-knuckled intensity of someone experiencing genuine emotional engagement with the drama unfolding below. Holmes had produced a small notebook and was writing rapidly, his movements economical and precise. Without taking his eyes from Box 5, he whispered to Watson, "Note the time, 8:47. The figure appeared during Shylock's speech about the differences between Christian and Jewish flesh. Observe the posture, the positioning, the apparent solidity of the apparition." Watson found his medical training asserting itself even in the face of this extraordinary phenomenon. His mind automatically began cataloguing details: the figure's apparent age, middle-aged, his dress, formal evening wear typical of the 1860s or 70s, his physical build, tall, somewhat thin, with the bearing of a man accustomed to public attention, and most strikingly the quality of absolute stillness that seemed to surround him. "Holmes," Watson whispered, "can you see his face clearly?" "Not from this angle, but the profile is consistent with the photographs I've seen of Edmund Blackwood. The hair, the set of the shoulders, the particular way he holds his head when concentrating, all match contemporary descriptions." The figure remained visible throughout Shylock's great speech, never moving except for the slight forward lean that suggested intense emotional investment in the performance. Watson found himself torn between fascination and a creeping sense of unease that had nothing to do with fear of the supernatural and everything to do with the profound sadness that seemed to emanate from the watching figure. It was during Portia's famous quality of mercy speech that the phenomenon reached its most striking intensity. As the actress on stage spoke Shakespeare's immortal words about mercy blessing both the giver and receiver, the figure in box 5 seemed to straighten slightly, his hands releasing their grip on the rail. For a moment Watson could have sworn he saw the man's lips moving, as if he were speaking the words along with the actress, his face turned slightly upward in an expression of almost religious reverence. Then, as the speech reached its conclusion and the stage lighting began to shift for the next scene, the figure simply wasn't there anymore. Watson blinked, looked again, rubbed his eyes, and stared hard at box 5. But it remained as empty as it had been at the beginning of the evening. The transition was so smooth, so complete, that for a moment he wondered if he had imagined the entire episode. Holmes, however, was writing furiously in his notebook, his pen moving across the page with the rapid precision of someone recording crucial evidence, while the details remained fresh in memory. His expression held the satisfaction of a man whose expectations had been not merely met, but exceeded in ways that promised genuinely interesting revelations. "Remarkable," Holmes murmured as the curtain fell for intermission. "Absolutely remarkable. Watson, did you observe the moment of disappearance? Was there any visible transition, any suggestion of movement or fading?" Watson shook his head, still somewhat stunned by what he had witnessed. "Nothing at all, Holmes. One moment he was there, clearly visible and apparently solid, and the next moment the box was empty. It was as if someone had simply turned off a light." Precisely my own observation, and yet for the duration of his presence, the figure appeared entirely real. The lighting fell on him naturally, his posture cast appropriate shadows, and his apparent engagement with the performance was completely convincing. They spent the intermission examining box 5 more closely, with Mr. Crane's permission entering the box itself to search for any mechanism that might explain what they had witnessed. Holmes applied his magnifying glass to every surface, examined the gas fixtures for any unusual modifications, and tested the floor and walls for hidden panels or concealed openings. Their search revealed nothing whatsoever. Box 5 appeared to be exactly what it seemed, a normal theatre box, properly maintained and entirely ordinary in every physical respect. Yet both men had clearly observed a figure occupying the space during the performance, a figure that had appeared and disappeared with no visible means of entry or exit. "Mr. Crane," Holmes said as they prepared to return to their own box for the second half, "has anyone ever reported seeing this figure during intermissions or before performances begin?" "Never, Mr. Holmes. The sightings are always during actual performance time, and most commonly during the more dramatically intense moments of whatever play we're presenting." The second half of the performance proceeded without incident. Box 5 remained empty throughout the final acts, showing no sign of the extraordinary phenomenon they had witnessed earlier. The play concluded to enthusiastic applause, and the audience began to disperse into the fog-wrapped London night, most of them entirely unaware that they had shared the theatre with what appeared to be a visitor from beyond the grave. As the theatre emptied, Holmes, Watson, and Mr. Crane remained behind to discuss what they had observed. The detective's usual air of detached analysis had given way to something approaching excitement, the look of a man who had encountered a puzzle worthy of his most focused attention. "Gentlemen," Holmes began, settling into one of the now empty orchestra seats, "what we witnessed this evening presents several features of extraordinary interest. The phenomenon appears to be genuine, Both Watson and I observed the same figure in the same location at the same time, with consistent details of appearance and behaviour. This rules out individual hallucination or suggestion." Watson nodded, though his expression remained troubled. "The medical man in me wants to find a rational explanation, Holmes, but I'm forced to admit that what we observed defies conventional understanding. The figure appeared completely solid and real, yet vanished without any visible means of exit. Mr. Crane's relief at having his account validated was evident in his entire posture. "Then you believe me, gentlemen? You saw what I saw?" "We saw something, Mr. Crane, that matches your description with remarkable precision. Whether what we saw was the spirit of Edmund Blackwood or something else entirely remains to be determined." Holmes's fingers had resumed their familiar steepling position. "However, our observation tonight has provided several important clues that may help us understand the true nature of these phenomena." The detective rose and began pacing among the empty seats, his mind clearly working through the implications of the evening's events. First, the timing. The figure appeared during moments of particular dramatic intensity and disappeared when the lighting changed. This suggests a connection between the phenomena and the emotional energy of the performance itself. Second, he continued, the apparent age and style of dress of the figure we observed are consistent with Edmund Blackwood's era, but they are also consistent with what any competent theatrical customer could achieve. This does not prove deception, but it doesn't rule it out either. Watson followed his friend's reasoning with the attention that came from years of collaboration on complex cases. But Holmes, the manner of appearance and disappearance suggest capabilities far beyond conventional theatrical illusion. How could anyone achieve such effects without leaving traces of the mechanism involved? An excellent question, Watson, and one that brings us to the most intriguing aspect of this entire mystery. Holmes paused in his pacing, his grey eyes bright with the anticipation of a significant revelation. "I believe the key to understanding these phenomena lies not in the supernatural realm, but in a careful examination of Edmund Blackwood's final days and the specific circumstances of his connection to this theatre." Mr. Crane leaned forward with evident interest. "What do you mean, Mr. Holmes?" "I mean, Mr. Crane, that ghosts, if indeed that is what we're dealing with, rarely appear without reason. If Edmund Blackwood's spirit is somehow connected to this theatre, there must be some unfinished business, some unresolved matter that ties him to this specific place and this particular production." The detective's expression had taken on the focused intensity that Watson recognised as the prelude to one of Holmes's most brilliant deductive leaps. "Tell me, Mr. Crane, what do you know about the circumstances surrounding Blackwood's final performance here? Was there anything unusual about that evening? Anything that might explain his apparent attachment to Box 5 specifically?" Mr. Crane considered this question with the thoroughness of a man whose livelihood depended on understanding the history and traditions of his profession. "The performance itself was by all accounts magnificent, Mr. Holmes. Critics wrote that Blackwood had never been better, that he seemed to channel not just his own artistry, but the accumulated wisdom of every actor who had ever portrayed Sherlock. And after the performance, that's where the story becomes somewhat mysterious. Blackwood was scheduled to attend a reception in his honour after the final curtain, but he never appeared. The theatre manager at the time reported that Blackwood had seemed unusually contemplative after taking his bows, and that he had requested a few moments alone on stage before joining the celebration. Holmes's interest sharpened visibly. Alone on stage? For how long? According to the stage manager's report, perhaps 20 minutes. When they finally went to find him, the stage was empty, and Blackwood was nowhere to be found in the building. He was discovered the next morning in his lodgings, apparently having died peacefully in his sleep. Watson felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cooling theatre, so his final moments in the theatre remain unaccounted for. Precisely, Doctor. Watson. And there's one more detail that may be significant. The box where you observed tonight's apparition, Box 5, was occupied that final evening by a critic named Reginald Harwick, who wrote for several London papers. Harwick's review of Blackwood's performance was less than kind. Holmes had stopped pacing entirely, his attention now focused with laser-like intensity on this new information. Less than kind in what way? Hyrick suggested that Blackwood's interpretation of Shylock was outdated, that his style belonged to an earlier era of theatrical performance. He wrote that while the audience seemed moved by nostalgia, true artistic progress required moving beyond such sentimental attachments to obsolete approaches. The implications of this revelation seemed to hang in the air like the fog outside the theatre windows. Watson found himself imagining the ageing actor, reading these harsh words and knowing that his career, his life's work, was being dismissed as irrelevant to a changing world. A devastating review for an actor near the end of his career, Watson observed quietly. Indeed, Holmes replied. And if our Edmund Blackwood spent his final 20 minutes in this theatre contemplating such criticism, particularly while standing on the stage where he had just delivered what he believed to be his finest performance. He trailed off, the implications clear. Mr. Crane's expression showed a dawning understanding. You think he's somehow still here, still trying to prove that critic wrong? I think, Mr. Crane, that we may be dealing with something far more complex than a simple haunting. If Edmund Blackwood died with his artistic legacy under attack, if he spent his final conscious moments in this theatre wrestling with questions about the value of his life's work, then his apparent return during performances of the very play that showcased his greatest triumph takes on profound significance. Holmes moved toward the stage, his footsteps echoing in the empty theatre with a sound that seemed both lonely and purposeful. Consider the evidence. The apparition appears only during performances, only during moments of dramatic intensity, and only when The Merchant of Venice is being performed. The play that represented both his greatest triumph and, in the critic's view, the obsolete style that he embodied. Watson joined his friend on the stage, looking up at Box 5 from the perspective that Edmund Blackwood would have had during his final performance. From this angle, the box seemed to loom over the playing area like a judgment seat, its occupant possessing the power to validate or condemn everything that occurred in the space below. But Holmes, Watson said, even accepting that Blackwood's spirit might be tied to this place by unfinished emotional business, how do we explain the physical manifestation? The figure we observed appeared entirely solid and real. Holmes's smile held the satisfaction of a man who had been waiting for exactly this question. Watson, what if the manifestation is not supernatural at all, but rather the result of forces we don't yet fully understand? What if intense emotional experience, combined with the specific acoustic and atmospheric properties of a building like this, can create phenomena that exist at the intersection of the physical and metaphysical? The detective gestured toward the ornate ceiling and walls of the theatre. This building was designed to focus and amplify emotional energy, to create a space where the boundary between reality and illusion becomes deliberately permeable. If Edmund Blackwood's final moments here were suffused with profound artistic and emotional intensity, if he died while still psychically connected to this space, you're suggesting that some part of his consciousness might have become permanently imprinted on the theatre itself. Watson's medical training rebelled against such speculation, yet he found himself unable to dismiss the logic of Holmes's reasoning. I am suggesting, Watson, that consciousness and memory may be forces that operate according to laws we have not yet discovered. Just as we now understand that light and sound can be captured and reproduced through mechanical means, perhaps intense emotional experience can leave traces that become visible under specific conditions. Mr. Crane had joined them on the stage, his expression mixing fascination with practical concern. But gentlemen, even if your theory is correct, what does this mean for the future of my theatre? Can we expect these manifestations to continue indefinitely? Holmes considered this question with the same systematic approach he brought to all aspects of his investigations. That, Mr. Crane, depends on what Edmund Blackwood's spirit, or memory, or psychic imprint, or whatever we choose to call it, is trying to accomplish. If he is indeed seeking vindication for his artistic legacy, then perhaps providing such vindication might lay these phenomena to rest. What do you mean? I mean, Mr. Crane, that criticism like Hyrick's gains power from going unanswered. If Blackwood died believing that his life's work had been judged and found wanting, Perhaps what his spirit needs is evidence that such judgment was premature and unfair. Watson was beginning to follow his friend's reasoning. You're thinking of some kind of tribute, a recognition of Blackwood's contributions to theatrical art? More than that, Watson. I'm thinking of a direct response to the specific criticism that may have haunted his final hours. Holmes's eyes had taken on the gleam that appeared whenever he conceived a particularly elegant solution to a complex problem. Mr. Crane, how would you feel about organising a special commemorative performance of The Merchant of Venice, dedicated specifically to honouring Edmund Blackwood's interpretation of Sherlock? Mr. Crane's initial surprise gave way to evident enthusiasm. It would be a wonderful tribute, Mr. Holmes, and excellent publicity for the production. But do you really think such a gesture would affect these supernatural manifestations? I think, Mr. Crane, that the human need for recognition and validation may be among the most powerful forces in existence. If Edmund Blackwood's consciousness is somehow tied to this theatre by unfulfilled emotional needs, then addressing those needs directly might indeed provide the resolution that both his spirit and your theatre require. The three men spent the remainder of the evening working out the details of Holmes's proposed solution. The commemorative performance would be scheduled for the following Sunday, exactly 1 week from their current investigation. Invitations would be extended to London's theatrical community, with particular attention to critics and historians who could speak knowledgeably about Blackwood's contribution to the art of acting. Most significantly, Box 5 would be specially decorated for the occasion and reserved as a place of honour for Blackwood's memory. If the detective's theory was correct, providing such explicit recognition might satisfy whatever emotional needs were driving the manifestations and allow the troubled spirit to find peace. As they prepared to leave the theatre and return to the fog-wrapped streets of London, Holmes paused for one final look at Box 5. The empty seats seemed to watch them with velvet patience, holding secrets that might soon be revealed. "Watson," Holmes said quietly, "do you think we are doing the right thing? Are we addressing genuine supernatural phenomena, or are we simply indulging in elaborate theatricality?" Watson considered his friend's question with the careful thought it deserved. "I think, Holmes, that whether we call it supernatural or natural may matter less than whether we're responding to genuine human need. If Edmund Blackwood's spirit is truly tied to this place by unresolved pain, then offering resolution serves the cause of compassion, regardless of the metaphysical mechanics involved. And if we're dealing with an elaborate hoax, then we're still honouring the memory of a gifted artist who deserves recognition for his contributions to London's cultural life. Either way, the outcome serves worthy purposes." Holmes nodded, his expression showing the satisfaction of a man whose course of action had been validated by sound reasoning. "Then let us proceed with our plan, Watson, and see whether next Sunday's performance brings peace to the Orpheum Theatre, and to whatever remains of Edmund Blackwood's troubled spirit." The journey back to Baker Street took them through fog-wrapped streets that seemed even more mysterious than they had earlier in the evening. The gaslight created pools of amber warmth that appeared and disappeared like islands in a grey sea, while the muffled sounds of late Sunday evening London, the distant chiming of church bells, the clip-clop of hansom cabs, the occasional burst of laughter from a public house, created a symphony of urban life settling into its nighttime rhythms. Both men remained largely silent during the ride, each lost in contemplation of the evening's extraordinary events. Watson found himself replaying the moment when the figure had appeared in Box 5, trying to reconcile what he had observed with his scientific understanding of the world. The image remained vivid in his memory, the leaning posture, the evident emotional engagement with the performance, the profound sadness that had seemed to emanate from the watching figure. Holmes, by contrast, appeared to be working through the logical implications of their planned intervention. His fingers drummed their familiar rhythm against the leather seat, and his eyes held a distant focus that indicated his mind was exploring multiple scenarios and calculating probabilities with the precision of a master chess player planning several moves ahead. "Holmes," Watson said as their cab turned onto Baker Street, "do you really believe that next Sunday's commemorative performance will resolve these phenomena? The detective's response came with the careful precision that characterized his most thoughtful observations. "I believe, Watson, that human consciousness, whether in its embodied or disembodied state, operates according to patterns that can be understood and addressed through systematic analysis. If Edmund Blackwood's manifestations are driven by unresolved emotional needs, then addressing those needs directly represents our best chance of achieving a peaceful resolution, and if your theory is incorrect..." Holmes's smile held the quiet confidence of a man who had built his career on the systematic application of logic to seemingly impossible problems. "Then we will have honoured the memory of a gifted artist, provided London's theatrical community with an evening of cultural enrichment, and demonstrated that even the most mysterious phenomena can be approached through careful observation and rational analysis. Hardly a wasted effort, even if our supernatural visitor proves more persistent than we hope." Their arrival at 221B Baker Street marked the end of one of the most unusual evenings either man had experienced in their years of collaboration. Mrs. Hudson had left a tray of tea and biscuits in their sitting room, along with a warm fire that chased away the fog's chill and created an atmosphere of comfortable domesticity that seemed almost surreal after their theatrical adventure. As they settled into their familiar chairs with cups of steaming tea, both men found themselves reflecting on the evening's events with a mixture of fascination and bewilderment. The peaceful Sunday afternoon that had begun with philosophical observations about London's Sabbath tranquillity had evolved into an investigation of phenomena that challenged conventional understanding of life, death, and the persistence of human consciousness. "Watson," Holmes said, staring into the dancing flames of their fireplace, "tonight we witness something that exists at the very boundary of human experience. Whether we classify it as supernatural or simply not yet understood by science, may be less important than recognizing that we live in a universe far more mysterious and wonderful than our daily routines might suggest." Watson nodded, his own gaze fixed on the fire's hypnotic patterns. "The medical man in me still rebels against accepting supernatural explanations, Holmes. Yet I cannot deny what my own eyes observed. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between the purely rational and the purely mystical, in a realm where consciousness and emotion operate according to laws we're only beginning to glimpse." The detective's response carried the weight of genuine philosophical reflection. "If tonight's events teach us anything, Watson, it may be that the boundary between the living and the dead, between present and past, between the possible and impossible, is far more permeable than we typically imagine." Outside their window, Baker Street had settled into its nighttime quiet, the fog continuing its patient work of transforming the familiar into the mysterious. The gaslight created pools of amber warmth that seemed to pulse with their own gentle rhythm, while the distant sounds of London's evening life, church bells, footsteps, the occasional carriage, created a lullaby that spoke of a great city preparing for sleep. Holmes rose from his chair and moved to his desk, where he began organising his notes from the evening's investigation with the systematic care he brought to all his cases. "Tomorrow, Watson, we begin preparations for what may prove to be the most unusual performance in the Orpheum Theatre's history. If our theory is correct, next Sunday evening will see the resolution of a mystery that has haunted London's theatrical community for more than a decade, and if our theory is incorrect, then we will have learned something valuable about the limits of rational analysis when applied to phenomena that may operate according to entirely different principles." Holmes's expression held the quiet satisfaction of a man who had found genuine intellectual stimulation in the day's events. Either outcome represents a victory for the systematic pursuit of truth, regardless of how strange or wonderful that truth might prove to be. As the evening settled into night and the fire burned lower in their grate, both men found themselves drifting toward the contemplative state that Sunday evening seemed designed to encourage. The fog outside their window continued its ancient work, wrapping London in a grey embrace that transformed the familiar into the magical, the mundane into the mysterious. Watson was the first to succumb to the drowsiness that had been building throughout their long day of investigation and revelation. His breathing deepened into the steady rhythm of sleep, his face relaxing into the peaceful expression of a man whose dreams were likely to be filled with foggy theatres and mysterious figures watching from elegant boxes. Holmes remained awake longer, his mind continuing to work through the implications of their evening's observations. Yet even the great detective eventually surrendered to the pull of sleep, his last conscious thought being a quiet sense of anticipation for the week ahead and the remarkable performance that would either solve their mystery or deepen it in ways that promised even greater fascination. The fog continued its patient vigil over London through the night, wrapping the great city in dreams and possibilities, carrying whispers of stories both ancient and eternal through streets that had witnessed countless tales of love, loss, ambition, and redemption. In theatres and homes, in palaces and tenements, the city slept and dreamed, while somewhere in the space between waking and sleeping, between memory and hope, the spirit of Edmund Blackwood perhaps found a moment's peace in knowing that his story was not yet finished, that recognition and understanding might yet be possible in a world that had seemed to pass him by. The week that followed their Sunday evening investigation passed with the peculiar mixture of routine and anticipation that characterizes periods when ordinary life continues while extraordinary events approach on the horizon. Holmes threw himself into the preparations for the commemorative performance with the same systematic intensity he brought to his most challenging criminal investigations, treating every detail as a potential key to solving the mystery of the Orpheum's supernatural visitor. Letters were dispatched to theatrical historians, prominent critics, and surviving members of London's acting community who had known Edmund Blackwood during his career. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. The proposal to honour one of the era's most gifted performers struck a chord with people who understood how quickly artistic achievement could be forgotten in a world that constantly demanded new sensations and fresh faces. Dr. Pemberton, the theatre historian at University College London, agreed to deliver a brief address about Blackwood's contributions to the interpretation of Shakespeare's complex characters. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, who had performed opposite Blackwood in several productions during the 1860s, promised to attend despite her advanced age and failing health. Most significantly, 3 of London's most respected dramatic critics, including the elderly Sir Reginald Morrison, whose reviews had helped establish the reputations of 2 generations of actors, committed to attending the special performance. Watson found himself fascinated by the process of organising what was essentially a memorial service for someone who had been dead for 12 years, but who might still be, in some inexplicable way, present and aware of the proceedings. The philosophical implications of their endeavour struck him as both profound and slightly absurd. They were planning a performance designed to provide comfort and recognition to someone who might or might not exist in any meaningful sense. "Holmes," Watson said one evening as they reviewed the guest list for the commemorative performance, "do you ever find yourself wondering whether we've embarked on an elaborate exercise in collective self-deception?" The detective looked up from his correspondence with the expression of a man who had been considering similar questions. "Constantly, Watson. Yet I find that the most important human endeavours often exist in that uncertain territory, between fact and faith, between what can be proven and what must simply be believed." Holmes set aside his pen and moved to their familiar window, where the evening fog was beginning its nightly transformation of Baker Street into something mysterious and otherworldly. Consider this. Even if Edmund Blackwood's spirit exists only in the memories and imaginations of those who knew his work, our commemorative performance still serves a vital purpose. We are asserting that artistic achievement has permanent value, that the courage and passion an actor brings to his craft deserves recognition even after death. Watson joined his friend at the window, noting how the gaslight created patterns of light and shadow that seemed to shift and dance with their own mysterious purpose. And if he is somehow genuinely present, somehow aware of our efforts, then we're demonstrating that compassion and understanding can transcend the ordinary boundaries of life and death. Either way, Watson, we're engaged in work that honours the best aspects of human nature. The evening of the commemorative performance arrived. with weather that seemed designed by a theatrical providence sensitive to dramatic appropriateness. Fog rolled through London's streets with unusual thickness, creating an atmosphere that transformed the entire city into something that might have emerged from one of the Gothic novels that were so popular among the reading public. Gas lamps struggled against the grey obscurity, creating pools of amber light that appeared and disappeared like islands in a ghostly sea. The Orpheum Theatre had been decorated for the occasion with a tasteful combination of morning creep and celebratory flowers that somehow managed to capture both the solemnity of memorial and the joy of artistic celebration. Box 5 had been adorned with a portrait of Edmund Blackwood in his most famous role, surrounded by white roses and a small placard that read, "In honour of Edmund Blackwood, 1830 to 1875, whose interpretation of Sherlock reminded London that great acting transforms both performer and audience." Holmes and Watson arrived early, taking their positions in Box 3 with the same systematic attention to observation that had characterised their previous visit. The detective had equipped himself with a more powerful magnifying glass and a notebook specifically dedicated to recording any phenomena they might observe during the evening's performance. The audience that gathered for this special performance represented a cross-section of London's theatrical and cultural elite, many of whom had known Blackwood personally or had been influenced by his approach to classical roles. The atmosphere in the theatre held a quality of hushed expectancy that went beyond the normal anticipation of an evening's entertainment. There was a sense that the audience had gathered to participate in something significant, though exactly what that something might be remained to be discovered. Dr. Pemberton's brief address, delivered from the stage before the curtain rose, captured the essence of what they were attempting to accomplish. "Edmund Blackwood," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed auditorium, understood that acting was not merely the recitation of memorized lines, but rather the art of making ancient words speak to contemporary hearts. His interpretation of Sherlock revealed depths of humanity in a character that lesser actors had reduced to caricature, reminding us that great art serves truth rather than prejudice. The scholar's words seemed to resonate through the theatre with particular power, as if the building itself were listening and approving of this recognition of one of its most gifted former inhabitants. Holmes noted that several audience members nodded in agreement, their expressions suggesting personal memories of performances that had moved and transformed them decades earlier. As the curtain rose on the familiar opening scene of The Merchant of Venice, Holmes and Watson settled into the focused observation that their investigation required. The production proceeded much as it had during their previous visit, with the same high quality of performance and the same evident engagement from an audience that had come prepared to appreciate both the play itself and the memory of the actor they were honouring. It was during the second act, as Sherlock delivered his famous speech about the similarities between Jews and Christians, that Holmes first detected the phenomenon they had come to witness. A subtle change in the quality of light around Box 5 caught his attention, followed by the gradual materialisation of a familiar figure leaning forward over the velvet rail. This time, however, the manifestation appeared different from their previous observation. The figure seemed more solid, more present, as if the explicit recognition and honour being paid to Blackwood's memory had somehow strengthened his ability to manifest in the physical world. Watson, following Holmes's gaze, drew in a sharp breath as he too observed the remarkable clarity with which their supernatural visitor appeared. The figure in Box 5 watched the performance with the same intense concentration they had observed previously, but his posture suggested something beyond mere artistic appreciation. There was a quality of deep satisfaction in the way he held himself, as if he were witnessing the vindication of principles and approaches that had been dear to his heart during his lifetime. Holmes began writing rapidly in his notebook, recording not only the timing and appearance of the manifestation, but also the subtle differences he observed compared to their previous encounter. The figure appeared more at peace, less tormented by whatever emotions had driven his earlier appearances. His hands rested calmly on the rail of the box rather than gripping it with desperate intensity, and his expression, visible now in greater detail, held a serenity that suggested profound emotional resolution. As Portia delivered her quality of mercy speech, The figure in box 5 straightened slightly and turned his head toward box 3, where Holmes and Watson sat watching. For a brief, extraordinary moment, the three men made direct eye contact across the space of the theatre, the living and the apparently dead acknowledging each other's presence with a recognition that transcended the ordinary boundaries of human experience. The figure's expression in that moment was one of unmistakable gratitude. His eyes, clearly visible despite the impossible nature of his presence, held a warmth and appreciation that spoke more eloquently than words could have done. He inclined his head slightly in a gesture that might have been a bow, or simply a nod of acknowledgement, his entire bearing suggesting a man who had finally received the recognition and understanding his spirit had been seeking. Then, as the applause for Portia's speech filled the theatre, something extraordinary happened. Instead of simply disappearing as he had during their previous observation, the figure in box 5 began to fade gradually, becoming translucent before slowly dissolving into the ambient light of the theatre. The transition was peaceful, gentle, like a soft sigh of contentment rather than the abrupt vanishing they had witnessed before. As the apparition faded, Holmes observed something that made him grip Watson's arm with sudden excitement. For just a moment, as the figure became nearly transparent, other shapes seemed to materialize around him, shadowy forms that might have been other actors, other performers who had found their final piece in this temple to dramatic art. The vision lasted only seconds, but it suggested that Edmund Blackwood had not been alone in his attachment to the Orpheum, and that their evening's work had perhaps provided resolution for more troubled spirits than they had imagined. The remainder of the performance proceeded without any further supernatural manifestations, but the atmosphere in the theatre had changed in subtle ways that both Holmes and Watson could sense. There was a lightness in the air, a sense of completion and peace that had not been present during their previous visit. Even the actors on stage seemed to perform with unusual inspiration, as if they too were aware that something significant had been resolved through their artistic efforts. When the final curtain fell, the applause was sustained and heartfelt, with many audience members rising to their feet in recognition of both the current performance and the memory of the actor they had gathered to honour. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, the elderly actress who had performed with Blackwood decades earlier, was observed to wipe tears from her eyes as she applauded, her expression suggesting that the evening had touched memories and emotions that went far beyond casual theatrical appreciation. After the audience had dispersed into the fog-wrapped London night, Holmes, Watson and Mr. Crane remained behind to discuss the evening's events. The theatre manager's relief was evident in every aspect of his demeanour. The tension that had marked their previous encounters had been replaced by a sense of peaceful satisfaction that suggested their strategy had achieved its intended purpose. "Gentlemen," Mr. Crane said as they settled into the now familiar orchestra seats, "I cannot adequately express my gratitude for what you have accomplished. Not only did we witness what appeared to be a final resolution of our supernatural visitor, but we also created an evening that honoured the memory of one of London's greatest actors in a manner worthy of his contributions to theatrical art." Holmes's expression held the quiet satisfaction of a man whose theoretical understanding had been validated by practical results. "Mr. Crane, tonight's events suggest that the human need for recognition and understanding may indeed be among the most powerful forces in existence. If Edmund Blackwood's spirit was tied to this theatre by unresolved emotional pain, then providing explicit recognition of his artistic achievements appears to have satisfied that need and allowed him to find peace." Watson nodded, though his medical training continued to wrestle with the metaphysical implications of what they had observed. "The change in his appearance tonight was remarkable, Holmes. Where previously he seemed tormented and desperate, tonight he appeared serene, even grateful. It was as if the mere act of acknowledgement had transformed his entire spiritual condition. Indeed, Watson, and the manner of his final departure suggests that whatever had bound him to this place has now been resolved. The gradual fading, the peaceful expression, the apparent presence of other spirits who may have found similar resolution, all of these details point to a genuine conclusion rather than a temporary absence." The detective rose and moved toward the stage, his footsteps echoing in the empty theatre with a sound that seemed both familiar and somehow different from their previous visits. The acoustics that had once carried whispers of unrest now seemed to hum with contentment, as if the building itself had been relieved of a burden it had carried for more than a decade. "Mr. Crane," Holmes called from the stage, "I believe you will find that your theatre's supernatural visitor has departed permanently. The phenomena that troubled your company were the result of unfinished emotional business rather than any malevolent haunting, and tonight's commemorative performance provided the resolution that Edmund Blackwood's spirit required." Mr. Crane joined them on the stage, his expression mixing professional relief with genuine wonder at the evening's extraordinary events. "Do you really believe he's at peace now, gentlemen? That these manifestations will not return?" Holmes's response carried the conviction of a man whose theoretical framework had been thoroughly tested and validated. "I believe, Mr. Crane, that human consciousness, whether embodied or disembodied, operates according to patterns of need and fulfillment that can be understood and addressed through careful analysis and compassionate action. Tonight we demonstrated that even the deepest spiritual unrest can be healed through recognition, understanding, and honour." Watson looked up at Box 5, which now appeared entirely ordinary, its red velvet seats and brass fittings showing no trace of the remarkable phenomena they had witnessed over the past week. It's strange to think that all he needed was acknowledgement, validation that his work had mattered and would be remembered. Not strange at all, Watson. Consider how many of the living spend their entire existence seeking exactly those things: recognition for their efforts, understanding of their struggles, assurance that their contributions have permanent value. Why should death necessarily eliminate such fundamental human needs? The three men spent several more minutes discussing the evening's events and their implications, but the conversation gradually took on the peaceful quality that comes when a challenging problem has been successfully resolved. The tension and mystery that had characterized their previous meetings had been replaced by the satisfaction of work well done and understanding achieved. As they prepared to leave the theatre and return to their respective homes through the fog-wrapped streets of London, Holmes paused for one final look at the stage where Edmund Blackwood had delivered his last great performance more than 12 years earlier. "Watson," the detective said quietly, "tonight we learned something valuable about the persistence of human consciousness and the power of compassion to heal even the deepest wounds. Whether we call it supernatural or simply not yet understood by science may matter less than recognizing our obligation to address suffering wherever and however we encounter it." Watson nodded, his own gaze fixed on the empty theatre that seemed somehow more alive, more vibrant than it had during their previous visits, and we learned that the boundary between life and death may be far more permeable than we typically imagine, that love and art and the need for understanding can transcend even the most fundamental apparent limitations. The journey back to Baker Street took them through fog-shrouded streets that seemed almost festive despite the late hour and obscured visibility. Church bells chimed midnight as their hansom cab navigated the familiar route, their bronze voices carrying a note of celebration that seemed perfectly appropriate for an evening that had seen the resolution of a mystery spanning more than a decade. Both men remained largely silent during the ride, each lost in contemplation of the extraordinary events they had witnessed and participated in. The implications of their evening's work extended far beyond the specific case of Edmund Blackwood's troubled spirit. They had discovered that systematic analysis and compassionate action could address phenomena that existed at the very boundary of human understanding. Their sitting room at 221B welcomed them with its familiar warmth and comfort, the dying embers of their morning fire providing just enough light to reveal the reassuring presence of their books, their chairs, their accumulated memories of years spent in collaborative investigation of London's most perplexing mysteries. Mrs. Hudson had left tea and biscuits as usual, along with a note expressing her hope that their evening at the theatre had been both educational and entertaining. As they settled into their chairs with steaming cups of tea, both men found themselves reflecting on how their peaceful Sunday afternoon of philosophical observation had evolved into one of the most remarkable weeks of their entire partnership. The case of the Orpheum Theatre had challenged their understanding of consciousness, memory, and the persistence of human emotion in ways that would influence their approach to future investigations. "Holmes," Watson said, staring into the dancing flames of their newly rekindled fire, "do you think we'll ever encounter another case quite like this one?" The detective's response came with the thoughtful precision that characterized his most profound observations. "I suspect, Watson, that once we learn to recognize phenomena that exist at the intersection of the physical and metaphysical, we may discover that such cases are far more common than we previously imagined. The world is full of unfinished business, unresolved emotions and spirits, living and dead, who seek understanding and peace." Holmes paused, his grey eyes reflecting the firelight as he considered the broader implications of their recent experience. Perhaps our true calling is not merely to solve crimes and catch criminals, but to serve as healers of a sort, helping to resolve the deeper mysteries of human experience that cause suffering and unrest. Watson nodded, finding profound satisfaction in this expanded understanding of their work together. Tonight we learned that compassion and recognition can be as powerful as logic and deduction in addressing the problems that trouble both the living and the dead. Indeed, Watson. And we learned that the systematic pursuit of truth, when combined with genuine empathy for those who suffer, can achieve results that neither approach could accomplish alone. Outside their window, Baker Street had settled into its deepest nighttime quiet, the fog continuing its ancient work of transforming the familiar into the mysterious. The gaslight created gentle pools of amber warmth that seemed to pulse with their own peaceful rhythm, while the distant sounds of London's sleeping life, the occasional footstep, the far-off chiming of church bells, the soft whisper of fog against window glass, created a lullaby that spoke of a great city at rest. As the fire burned lower and the night deepened around them, both men found themselves drifting toward the contemplative state that marked the end of successful investigations. The case of Edmund Blackwood's troubled spirit had been resolved not through violence or confrontation, but through understanding, recognition, and the healing power of human compassion applied to suffering that transcended the ordinary boundaries of life and death. Holmes was the first to succumb to the drowsiness that had been building throughout their long and extraordinary day. His breathing deepened into the steady rhythm of sleep, his sharp features relaxing into an expression of peaceful satisfaction that spoke of a man whose work had served worthy purposes and achieved meaningful results. Watson remained awake slightly longer, his medical mind continuing to process the implications of what they had witnessed and accomplished. Yet even his analytical nature eventually surrendered to the pull of sleep, his last conscious thought being a quiet sense of gratitude for the privilege of participating in work that addressed the deepest mysteries of human existence. The fog continued its patient vigil over London through the remainder of the night, wrapping the great city in dreams and possibilities, carrying whispers of stories both ancient and eternal through streets that had witnessed countless tales of love, loss, hope, and redemption. In the Orpheum Theatre, Box 5 sat empty and peaceful, no longer haunted by unrest, but blessed instead with the serenity that comes when recognition is finally achieved and understanding is at last attained. Somewhere in the space between sleeping and waking, between memory and peace, between the world of the living and whatever realm awaits beyond, the spirit of Edmund Blackwood perhaps smiled one last time, before releasing his long hold on earthly concerns and accepting the deeper rest that his troubled soul had sought for more than 12 years. The mystery of the Orpheum Theatre had been solved not through conventional investigation, but through the application of wisdom that recognized suffering in all its forms and responded with the healing balm of compassion, understanding, and honor. In a world often marked by indifference and forgetfulness, Holmes and Watson had demonstrated that even the dead deserve recognition, that artistic achievement has permanent value, and that the systematic pursuit of truth, when guided by empathy and respect, can achieve miracles that transcend the ordinary limitations of human experience. And so the fog rolled gently through London's sleeping streets, carrying with it the whispered promise that mysteries, however deep or ancient, yield ultimately to patient understanding and compassionate action, that in a universe far stranger and more wonderful than daily routine might suggest, every story of suffering can become, through proper attention and care, a story of healing and peace. If this gentle tale of mystery and resolution has carried you toward the edge of sleep, I hope you'll let me know where in the world you're listening to these whispered stories. They travel far on nighttime winds, finding their way to restless minds in need of peace. What stories would you like me to explore next? Perhaps another Victorian mystery, or a tale from a different time and place where the boundary between the possible and impossible grows thin? Leave your suggestions in the comments below, and remember to subscribe if these midnight narratives bring you comfort. Until next time, may your dreams be filled with fog-wrapped streets, gaslit mysteries, and the gentle resolution that comes when understanding finally illuminates the shadows of the unknown. That's where our story fades tonight. Are you resting beneath the amber glow of Budapest, the calm rice fields of Ubud, the icy hush of Nuuk, or the ocean breeze of Amalfi? If this tale brought a sense of peace, like the episode and subscribe for more restful nights like this. Let the quiet wrap around you. Let your dreams unfold gently. Sleep softly now, wherever you are in this vast and sleeping world.